The Night Jim Spent in the Belly of a Whale by John Simpson, Adventurers Club. We turn back the hands of the clock to bring what many people claim is the most amazing sea story ever told. The biggest fish story of all is the one about Jonah and the whale, and yet it could be true, because the same thing once happened to a young British seaman called James Bartley. He too was swallowed by a whale. Bartley was a tough, well-muscled crewman on the English whaler Star of the East. It was in the days when the Falkland Islands was a great whaling base, and the whaler spent much of her time cruising in the waters south of them. Her prey, the great barrel-headed sperm whales, the 60 to 70-foot kin of Moby Dick. One day at the height of the season, the lookout suddenly bellowed his warning, "Fire she blows!" It was a huge sperm whale about 3 miles off. 2 boats were lowered and the chase began. As the first boat neared the whale, the harpooner standing in the bow hurled his harpoon deep into its flesh. Then everything seemed to happen at once. The whale began rolling and blowing, churning the water with its huge tail. The first boat managed to draw clear, but the second wasn't so lucky. The whale's tail came up under it and threw the boat high in the air, scattering its yelling crew in all directions. Bartley was thrown straight out of the boat and plunged into the water. As he sank, he heard a tremendous rushing noise, which he thought was the sound of the whale's tail swirling through the water. Then suddenly he was surrounded by a great darkness. He felt he was slipping down a passage which had movements of its own. Bartley closed his eyes in terror. At any moment he expected to die, but instead he was carried into a large, dark chamber. Bartley stretched out his arms and touched the walls of his prison. They yielded and were covered in a thick slime. In that horrifying instant, Bartley realized he had been swallowed alive by the whale. Bartley was sick and fainting with fear, but he managed to keep hold of his senses. He found he could breathe, but the heat was almost unbearable. It was also absolutely silent, a dreadful, overpowering silence which sent waves of panic through his brain. He could hear nothing. Blind terror. But worst of all were the wet, astringent juices in which he was partly immersed. For a few hours, Bartley managed to keep reasonably calm. He beat back the great waves of panic and tried to face the prospect of a slow death in the dark. But no amount of philosophizing could hold back his terror. He became weak and sick. Suddenly, Bartley screamed. He jumped to his feet and beat his fists against the stomach walls in a blind fury, kicking against the thick, yielding slime. He tore at the stomach walls, trying to make the whale belch him out. He screamed until he could scream no more. And finally he huddled down on his knees, shaking and trembling, whimpering and praying, and pleading till he lost consciousness. After the whale had dived, one boat stopped to pick up the men struggling in the water, while the others continued the chase. All were saved but 2. One of the missing was James Bartley. The boat pulled back to the parent ship with the survivors. Soon the other boats returned. They had eventually killed the whale. The whale was secured alongside the Star of the East. After a short burial service had been set for Bartley and the other missing man, the crew turned in for the night. At dawn the ship's crew got down to the messy job of cutting up the whale. It was while this was being done that one of the crew noticed a slight, spasmodic movement within the stomach. "It's a fish," said the older hands casually, knowing it was common to find 10-foot and even 16-foot sharks inside sperm whales. So a few of the hands slit open the giant stomach to see what was the catch within a catch, and found Bartley. Hair turned grey, unconscious, doubled up, hands and face and neck shriveled by the gastric juices, but still alive. Someone screamed. Others dropped to the deck in prayer. Gently they took Bartley out. The uncovered parts of his body were whitened and shriveled to the appearance of old parchment, and his dark hair had turned a dirty grey. He looked like an old man. One of the men bent over him. Bartley was breathing, but only just. His shipmates threw buckets of sea water over him until his eyes crept open and frightened mumbles came from his mouth. Then they rushed him to the captain's cabin. He was covered in a pile of blankets and hot liquor forced down his throat. When Bartley regained consciousness, he was like an animal. His speech was a cracked cackle of unintelligible fears. At any sudden sound, his eyes went mad with fright. For a fortnight, the cabin had to be kept locked. Gradually, Bartley regained his senses, and by the end of the 3rd week, he was able to describe his ordeal in all its horror. When the Star of the East returned to England, the seaman was sent to a London hospital to have the ghastly disfigurements of his skin treated. But the treatment was unsuccessful, and he returned to his ship. Mentally, Bartley was almost unharmed. The experience seemed to have affected him little more than a bad dream would have. So he went back to the sea, and the only trade he knew, whale catching. Science says maybe. Dr. Francis Fraser, keeper of zoology, Natural History Museum, and one of the world's leading marine experts, says it is possible for a whale to swallow a man. Sharks as big as a man have been found in the stomach of a whale. Only some whales, not the sperm whale, have tiny 6-inch throats. Dr. Fraser was more skeptical of a man's chance of survival. But 2 men who investigated Bartley's story, the French scientist M.D. Parville and the famous Liverpool engineer Sir Francis Fox, both ended by believing it.